Good evening and welcome to the virtual Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Will Frankel and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows this year. At the outset of my high school AP United States History course, my teacher spent one obligatory class on what he termed the pre-Columbian era in America. He read the class a list of names of major tribes, Cherokee, Apache, Iroquois, and asked the class, quote, "What do you think of when I read those names? They all sound pretty warlike to me," end quote. This comment is both disturbing and revealing. To paraphrase Nelson Mandela, no one is born believing things about people because of their race. People must instead learn racism. Tonight's speaker will explain the role that legacy media in particular has played in creating myths and stereotypes about Indigenous communities. Graham Lee Brewer is an associate editor for Indigenous Affairs at High Country News and a regular contributor to NPR and the New York Times. Over the course of his career, Brewer's coverage has spanned criminal justice and politics in Oklahoma, and in recent years, representative and place-based reporting on Indigenous communities. He's a winner of numerous local and national awards, both for his reporting and for High Country News' Indigenous Affairs desk. Brewer serves on the board of directors for the Native American Journalists Association, where he helps other reporters ethically and responsibly write about and for Indigenous communities. He's also a member of the Cherokee Nation. Using the written Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, we will be accepting questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send a question, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. And now, please join me in welcoming Graham Lee Brewer to the Athenaeum.
Thank you so much for having me, Will. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. I wish I could be there in person, of course, but I'm happy to be here virtually. So I will apologize in advance because my presentation is a little slide heavy, but I think for some of the reasons that Will kind of got at in his introduction, I think it's really important to see some of what I'm talking about to really understand just how insidious some of the portrayals of Indigenous people have been in the media for a long time, since well before the beginning of the country. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint here with you. So this is the Cherokee Phoenix. So something that I think is relatively unknown by most American audiences is that newspaper journalism is actually has a long history in Indigenous tribes. My tribe, I'm particularly proud to say that this Cherokee Phoenix, the newspaper you see here, was first printed in 1821 in New Echota, which is present-day Georgia. And it predates the New York Times by almost a quarter of a century, and the Washington Post by, I think, 48 years, somewhere close to half a century. It was a means to not only give our tribal citizens news about what was happening within our communities and on our lands, but it was also a way to show the outside world that we were humans that deserved basic humanity and respect. At the time, the Georgia government was passing laws that basically allowed Georgia citizens to steal and maim at will with no legal ramifications. And so the paper was used as a way to express its humanity. I think this is kind of embodied in the masthead, the rising phoenix with the word protection above it. The paper really was a means of protection. And it's still, to this day, a means of protection. In fact, the paper was printed in both Cherokee and English in 1821, and it still is to this day. Excuse me. This is a Silverhorn Calendar. Just to my west, the Kiowa tribe is headquartered in southeastern Oklahoma. And the Kiowa tribe have been documenting their calendars through visual representations since time immemorial. This is just one grab of I think just a few years that Silverhorn did in the 1800s, and they documented everything from battles to disease, crops, things like that. You could find an entire year's worth of news basically compiled in one giant document in certain cases with Silverhorn. And these are, I would argue, visual forms of journalism that existed long before the United States was a country. We see a lot of graphic journalism happening more and more today. And this is often kind of referred to as this kind of new or novel way of telling journalism. And I would argue that the Kiowa have been doing it for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is a ledger drawing. These are a little bit more known to most American audiences, I guess. They're you often see them drawn on ledger paper or on printed documents. That's why they're called ledger drawings, because they were just using the paper that they had accessible. And so this one was actually taken by a group of prisoners who were taken to a fort in Florida under the care of General Pratt, who some of you may know from his famous line, kill the Indian, save the man. His goal was to completely culturally assimilate Native Americans and turn them into, for lack of a better term, white, everyday, average Americans. While they were captive here in 1875, this is a drawing of them. They would be made to dance and, dress up in their regalia for visitors or soldiers who came to ogle at them. This is also a form of journalism. At the time this was made, magazines like Harper's and newspapers across the country were talking about the glory of the battle against, Indian savages, the westward move for more land. They were depicting Native Americans and indigenous peoples all across the country as lesser than. They were not representing them as they really were. And so this is journalism. This is indigenous journalism made by indigenous people for indigenous people. If you are a descendant of one of the people who was captive in this fort, this is the only form of journalism you have that can accurately represent what happened to your family. Because, at the same time, we see depictions like this. This was painted just a year later in 1876. And it's obviously Custer's last stand, but it's showing Custer and his soldiers in this heroic, form. This was made for evening newspapers. Obviously, what we know now of Custer and what he was doing, I wouldn't paint him in a heroic light. But that's how American audiences were primed to see him and what happened at Little Bighorn. This is, by the way, a W.M. Carey painting or etching that was used for the evening newspapers. In the 1920s, just less than 2 decades after Oklahoma became a state, you fast forward a little bit, and this is the work of Thomas Pula, who was a Kiowa photographer who worked in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is taken in the early to mid 20s. It's a picture of a group of Kiowa women who are returning to the reservation with Christmas gifts. Again, this is indigenous journalism made by indigenous people for indigenous people. It's an accurate representation of who they were, what they were doing, what their lives were like. This came on the heels of people like Edward Curtis. I guarantee you, most of you have seen an Edward Curtis photo somewhere. Edward Curtis traveled the country around the turn of the century and took these really breathtaking photos of indigenous peoples. But what we later came to learn about his photos was that he staged people in regalia, sometimes regalia that didn't match their cultural heritage, because Curtis was more interested, I think, in the art of the photo than he was in the true documentation of the people he was taking photos of. And you can see that here in the side-by-side comparison. On the left, which is the image that ultimately Curtis used. On the right was the original, and you can see he removed the clock in the middle because a clock is an illustration of technology, and that wasn't something Curtis was interested in showing. And so these are all shaping how we view indigenous people. These are all shaping our worldview. These are the accessible ways that we have to understand who Indigenous peoples are, what they look like, what they're capable of. And so it's no wonder that that there's misrepresentation. It's still lingering today. If you fast forward to today, that like I mentioned earlier, the Cherokee Phoenix is still, covering issues in the community that as newspapers dwindle across the country. I've been I've been the victim of a newspaper layoff myself here in Oklahoma at one point. But the Cherokee Phoenix is still writing stories for Cherokee people by Cherokee people. But what you really get when you don't hire Indigenous journalists, when you don't take the time to re-educate yourself about who Indigenous people are in a modern context, you get stories like this. So this was, I think we're all very familiar with Standing Rock, what happened there. This headlines like this at Bloomberg, this is problematic for a variety of reasons. One of which is that calling them the Sioux tribe is not entirely accurate at all. It's kind of an outdated way to describe several tribes, a whole group of people across a vast region, relying on old stories of the Black Snake prophecy, when really that was a story that, as I'll get into a little bit later, should have been it should have been reported in a much more ethical and responsible way. And I'll kind of give you an example of what I'm talking about. So when we, as journalists, base our interpretations of who Indigenous people are off of Hollywood, off of other forms of popular culture, it can lead to stories like this. This is just from 2012. This is in the New York Times. This is a story about some violence on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. And there's a variety of things wrong with this piece. For one, it's extremely too vague. Indian reservation is something that really kind of, it's just this blanket. It covers it over, like, where are we talking about specifically? And I think just that lack, I know that seems like a really small example, but just the sheer lack of not giving a sovereign nation its name in the headline and reference just shows you just how vague and unknown these places look to the reporters and editors who are covering them. But this story really talks about this rise in violence on the reservation, and I think it really has some language in it that I think is highly problematic. I'm going to read you just a quick excerpt from this story. So, quote, "Crime may be Wind River's most pressing problem, but it has plenty of company. Life, even by the grim standards of typical American Indian reservation, is as bleak and punishing as that of any developing country." It also goes on to give statistics about life expectancy, unemployment, dropout rates, suicide data, child abuse, sexual assault figures. The picture becomes very clear that seamless violence or senseless violence is an intrinsic, if not central part of being Indigenous. It's especially here on the Wind River Reservation. And this kind of framing really illustrates to me what I see when I see reporting like this. It tells me that this reporter parachuted in when they perceived a tragedy, and they didn't take any efforts to understand this community, who they are, what they need. This is reporting about Indigenous people, not reporting for Indigenous people. And what that story really failed to mention was that this is a systemic problem that is not really an accident. 60% of Indigenous people on tribal lands who are victims of violent crime describe their attacker as white. That's according to the Department of Justice. So that's a pretty staggering figure. Most of the time when an Indigenous person is attacked on tribal lands, according to the US government, the person who attacked them was white. And so that is not, like I said, not an accident. It's a result of broken federal policy. I think it's slightly more than half now. It's gotten slightly better, but slightly, like, let's just call it half. Half of cases in Indian country, violent crimes in Indian country, are declined for prosecution. because the federal government has has jurisdiction over those crimes. If you came to Carrie Aspinwall, my colleague and friends, talk about the story that we covered together for the Marshall Project and High Country News, Carrie got into this pretty extensively. This is tribes don't have the jurisdiction to try extremely violent crimes in their tribal lands, and so it gives predators a place to exploit. But if you look at the New York Times story, it blames ghosts, right? The ghosts of the innocent killed in an 1864 massacre. Like I said, this isn't the fault of ghosts. It's the fault of broken federal policy. If you look at the Violence Against Women Act, for instance, I mean, just last year, politicians on Capitol Hill used that provision that is supposed to protect women, and when it comes to Indian country, that address the rampant pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women that spans from Canada to Mexico. It was used as a political football. And so that's the real harm that not reporting the facts can do. But it's kind of like I mentioned earlier, this is really no surprise. This is what our audiences have been primed to see. They've seen John Ford Westerns, they've seen comic books, they've seen the creative staging of some of our most iconic paintings. The first Thanksgiving, just look at the creative staging at place in this photo. The Indigenous people down on the ground with animals and children, accepting food from the gracious pilgrims. These early representations should be viewed as foundational documents created for a singular purpose: to manufacture support for the control, conquest, possession, and exploitation of Indigenous people, land, and resources. So the misperceptions that we have of Indigenous people that manifest themselves today in the media, they are by design. This is a Dash for the Timber. It's a famous Remington painting. John M. Coward has this really great book called Indians Illustrated, where he talks about the visual representations of Indigenous people historically in the media. And he notes in one of his chapters that this painting was chosen by the readers of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, I think it was like 10 years ago, maybe 2006. I can't quite recall off the top of my head. Yes, 2006. As the painting, they voted this painting as the one that most represents their culture and heritage. It's painting of some, quote unquote heroic cowboys running away from their pursuers, the savage natives in the background. I think that kind of glorification of a really violent history is, again, on purpose. It's a failure of our public education system and our government to teach us the true history of our origins. The violence and deprivation are most of what we get, and the other one is sex. This cover is from 2017 of Pocahontas. I think most of you who are familiar with Pocahontas' story, I would hope by now are familiar with how she was taken advantage of. She was a child. And to see her in 2017 depicted this way on the front of a magazine is just another example of how easy it is to get away with this when it comes to Indigenous people. Indigenous people are typically, they also have this new component in modern media to add on to the ideas of violence and sex, and that is plight and dysfunction. And so this was a rule made by Duncan McHugh, really talented journalist with the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and a professor who teaches a really wonderful class on reporting in Indigenous communities. And these are the ways that Duncan kind of broke down how Indigenous people typically make the news. And if you go back and look at like a lot of the early coverage of Standing Rock, you'll find elements of these everywhere. You'll find a war, you'll find a drum circle, you'll find somebody dancing, you'll find a paragraph that talks about alcoholism or suicide rates. And then there's the data. So Indigenous statistics are typically not what I would consider neutral entities. They definitely have a bias. And so these are the 5 categories that this data typically falls into. and it'll show one of these different different categories in some way. And so one of my favorite examples of this is the Washington Post doing a poll to ask its readers. They did a phone poll of self-identified Native Americans to ask them the question whether they thought the name of the football team in Washington, D.C. was offensive. So in the first time in the Washington Post's storied history, this is a really, really old, very, very important to American audiences newspaper. And the first time in the Washington Post history, they want to do a poll of Native Americans. And that's the question that they chose to ask. I don't understand the necessity of asking a group of marginalized people if a racial slur meant to further marginalize them is offensive. And if this is the first time that you have ever polled Native Americans across the country, that's the question that you want to ask. That doesn't seem like a neutral piece of data to me. And these misperceptions of Indigenous people find other really nasty ways to manifest themselves in the modern media. This is another really famous case out of my tribe, the baby Veronica case, which was about a girl who is Cherokee, and her father who was trying to stop her adoption by some white parents. And this headline alone is a really great example of a journalist and editor's failure to understand what indigeneity is, what it means to be Indigenous. Baby Veronica was never a question of whether she was white or Native American. It was a question of who was she a citizen of? And she was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And so an adoption case between two sovereign nations requires that the government be a part of that. And the Indian Child Welfare Act was a law that was created under the Carter administration to protect the rampant theft of Native children but in foster care and boarding schools. And so this law was put in place to stop this very thing. And so it was only right that it be used. And you can see down below, I actually cut out the photo that they used of her. So just putting this photo of this little girl and then asking whether or not she's white or Native is just so inappropriate. And then we see this really with Elizabeth Warren, again, something to do with my tribe, the Cherokee Nation. This is from the Boston Globe, where they are openly talking about the percentage of Native blood that may exist in Elizabeth Warren's body. I just think this is repellent. Like, I can't believe this. And furthermore, we don't have a blood quantum in the Cherokee Nation. It wouldn't, if Elizabeth Warren could have shown that she was part of our community and had lineage and we claimed her, then it wouldn't have mattered if she was 164th or 1024th. No one would have cared because she would have been an accepted member of our community. And that's all that matters. So back to Standing Rock, just real briefly, I think really this is kind of where we saw this kind of explode in the mainstream media. And I just want to point out that while we're very familiar with images like this of Standing Rock, if reporters had actually really cared about what was happening there, this story existed in court documents, government memos, tribal council meeting memos, long before it ever hit the national news. But national reporters didn't show up until the story was beneficial for them, until they saw something in it that they could take when people were being attacked by dogs, shot by rubber bullets, or sprayed with freezing water and freezing temperatures. I think this story for a lot of people was kind of romantic or woke, and it was described really as anything than it was, which is a story that American journalism helped create. I think for most American audiences, we live as Indigenous people, we live in your imagination. And so when coverage like this happens, it's really no surprise. And I'll just kind of leave you with this thought, which is that stories in Indigenous communities are resources. They're extremely important. Who gets to tell them, who safeguards them, what they mean. Those are all really important things. And so when a reporter parachutes into Indian country for a perceived tragedy instead of trying to get to know that place. Can you turn that light back on? They are extracting a resource, prepackaging it for their own audience and extracting it. And I don't see that as any different than the logging or mining industries. And it allows your publication to become a venue for exploitation colonialism, which is an ongoing problem. Something I tell newspaper reporters and just reporters that I train in general, it is that it's really important to remember that colonialism is not something that happened in our past. It's not an event that we got past. It's a structure that we still live inside of. It's still a major part of deciding government policy. When Indian Health Services isn't fully funded, it's not quote unquote underfunded. That's Congress willfully deciding to break the law because it's breaking its treaty obligations to uphold the health of the tribes that it entered them with. And so I think those little framings, things like that, I think it's just really important to remember that these are all structural issues. Deb Haaland is probably going to take over the Department of Interior. And it's interesting to me to think that she's going to take over a department that is literally tasked with managing her demographic. The Department of Interior is literally tasked with managing Native American people. That's kind of an interesting distinction, I would argue. And I would just point really quickly that there are resources out there. We have them at nausea, but I more importantly, I'd really just like to encourage people to look to tribal media because it does exist. It's robust. And there's some really great examples of, again, Indigenous journalism by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And I will stop with that.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Now we're just going to shift to the audience Q&A. So the first question is from a student. They want to know if you know of any news articles or media organizations that were ever funded by the American government to depict Indigenous people in a negative or simplistic light.
I don't know. I mean, I think really you can find examples of that in media at any given point in American history if you look close enough. So kind of like what I was getting at with that etching of Custer earlier, the framing of those stories has always been one-sided. I really like how German Westerns in the 60s and I think in the 50s were told through the eyes, a lot of them were told through the eyes of Indigenous people, and they were the heroes and the villains were the cowboys. And it was kind of like, it was a critique of American imperialism. And I think you could apply that same logic to the news industry easily. So I think it was the LA Times a few years ago had this story about a village. I think it was in like southern Kansas, and they had kind of unearthed this like ancient ruin underneath the town of an old village, of an old Indigenous village. And the lead was kind of something to the effect that, like, you know, there was this kind of sleepy little town in southern Kansas, and there was always a rumor of a town underneath. And if you were telling that story from the Indigenous perspective, the lead would be, there's a sleepy little town in Kansas, and then somebody came and built a town on top of it, right? So I think it's just important to remember, like, when you're a journalist and you go, you ask yourself, like, who, what, when, where, why, like, why am I here? What makes this story unique? But then I think you should apply this other lens to it, which is, how has colonialism shaped the landscape, both philosophically, theoretically, and physically? Like, whose land am I standing on, and why is it that way? And so I think you can look at any framing of public policy when it comes to the management of the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Certainly under Zinke and the Trump administration, you can see the way they tried to consolidate the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. I think just some of the language that they used around Bears Ears. The American government, it's always been in the American government's, you know, best interest to frame Indigenous peoples as, I guess, you know, one way to put it is just like a necessary casualty for American progress. So David Troyer has this really great book called Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And he has this line in there, something like, you know, we're kind of told, like, America began with Native Americans and it ends with, like, what we have today, but there's no sense that the two meet. And so I think that's very much the way the American government and the American media have classically framed stories about Indigenous peoples.
Next question is how you would compare the coverage of the Muskogee Nation's victory in the Supreme Court last year between Indigenous and non-Indigenous press sources.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I really like this distinction. I think if you look to the Muskogee Creek Nation's media arm, Muskogee Media, you'll find some of the best reporting about the decision because it is for that tribe, right? And those are reporters that have those tribal citizens in mind when they're writing and asking questions. And so, yeah, I definitely see a difference. And I did a piece last year for, we did a piece in partnership with New York Times, me and Simone Romero, about Governor Kevin Stitt here in Oklahoma and his battle with the tribal leadership of all these different tribal nations over casino revenue. And one of the main reasons I even pitched that story was because I was kind of frustrated with some of the coverage I was seeing, because Stitt was saying some things that were like pretty easily disproven about the way he was framing it, and even just some of the basic facts about the tribal nations that he was talking about. And when I noticed that none of those facts he wasn't getting called out in any of the press conferences about any of these stumbles, I kind of realized it was because the reporters didn't know that he was making mistakes. And so it was really important for me to try to be able to put a stamp on that story that says, like, that had some real understanding about sovereignty and its role in the whole battle. And so when it comes to McGirt, I will say this: I've actually been really surprised and with a lot of the coverage. I think a lot of the reporters in Oklahoma who are friends and colleagues of mine are really committed to getting those little tiny nuances that I mentioned earlier right. Like I get calls and texts from good friends of mine who are editors at local outlets, just asking for advice. And while I don't say that, I've made it clear that I'm open to having those calls. So I would never tell you to just call your native friends and ask them all these questions. But I see those calls as a sign of progress. That those are questions that the journalists are asking themselves that they want to get right. And I think I think a lot of them are learning that you probably will get something right. There's almost 600 federally recognized tribes in the country. I would never pretend to know something about even most of them. And so the potential to get something wrong when you cover Indian country more broadly, or like in Oklahoma where there's 39 tribes, it's still a lot to get to know. I'm encouraged to see that the reporters who are non-native here, when they do make a mistake, they're more willing to listen. And I think that is the real mark of what kind of journalist you're going to be and what kind of trust you're going to be able to build in Indian country.
Are there any particular theorists you like or think are useful to understanding North American colonialism?
Yeah, there's a lot of Indigenous writers, obviously. I really like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Roxanne lives, I believe, in San Francisco, so she's in California. She's from Oklahoma, really, really wonderful, thoughtful writer. But that book will really challenge your perceptions of American history. And it'll show you how modern day policy is still guided by colonialism, like I mentioned earlier. I think if you want to learn more about Standing Rock and how the coverage was wrong and kind of what led up to that moment, I would really recommend Nick Estes, who wrote a book, Our History is the Future. And it's, kind of his summation of what happened. It's a really, really tremendous piece of work. I mentioned earlier David Troyer, who's a Ojibwe, Heartbeat. His book Heartbeat of Wounded Knee is just kind of this re-examination of this idea that that American or Native American people, like Indigenous people, that our glory is behind us. And Troyer would very much argue that our glory is ahead of us. And I certainly would agree with them. There's when we were forcibly removed on the Trail of Tears, there were 16,000 Cherokee people, and 4,000 of them, about estimated 4,000, died along the way. And now there's almost 400,000 of us. We have an economic footprint in the billions of dollars annually, and employ tens of thousands of people across the state. Our diaspora reaches around the world. And so I very much agree with David Troyer that our glory is ahead of us. So.
Our next question is another one from a student who asks, given the clear problems that American journalists have caused through poor journalism, the lack of understanding of the culture and people, and misrepresentation of Indigenous people, do you think coverage of Indigenous people should be reserved for only Indigenous journalists? Or what advice would you give to reporters in order to report on Indigenous communities if they're not themselves Indigenous?
That's an interesting question. Newspapers and radio stations, publications all across the country, we get a lot of outreach at the Native American Journalists Association from them, because they want to hire Indigenous people. And less than 0.5% of newsroom employees in the country are Indigenous. And typically some of those reporters do fall into Indigenous affairs beats, because one of the things that some of my colleagues on the board have done is help places like Report for America, for instance, build these Indigenous affairs bureaus at radio stations and newspapers all across the West, in particular. And we do try to get Indigenous people in those roles, but I would never pigeonhole Indigenous journalists into saying like they're the only ones who should be covering that, because I cover Indian country almost exclusively, and I do enjoy that. But like I also like writing about other things, and from time to time I still write about criminal justice issues and culture. And so I think it's important that just recognizing that having those voices in the newsroom can change things. It kind of makes me think of this lawmaker from New Mexico I interviewed. This was years ago when I first got to High Country News. And she was talking about being Indigenous and being in the room when other lawmakers, who were typically white men, were making decisions, and just how her presence alone changed the tone of the conversations. I see mistakes that newspapers make all the time, and I think just like, man, if they just had like an Indigenous copy editor, or if they had like an Indigenous reporter who wasn't even on that beat, but maybe got caught wind of that story, like that never would have happened, because they would have seen it miles ahead before. And so I think it's really, really important that we get Indigenous people in newsrooms. And I do think it's good to have Indigenous people covering them. But on the other hand, if I were to say that only Indigenous people should be covering those stories, then there goes like 95% of the coverage of Indigenous communities on the national level, for sure. Because we're not in those newsrooms to be reporting those stories. And so I do think that there's a place, and as journalists, like you're kind of a perpetual outsider. Like you're always going to be an outsider. That's just, you get good at being an outsider, and then you become an insider and you get the story. We're kind of taught as journalists that it's like, you're going to kind of come in and you're going to not stumble your way around, but you're going to have to learn like while you're there, and you should be learning all the time. And you're kind of taught it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And it's really different in Indian country. Like you really have to stay and establish those relationships. I tell reporters who are new to the beat and who aren't Indigenous that there's a 99% likelihood that whoever you work for, you're going to have to go into this Indigenous community, and you're going to have to be a reporter, and you're going to have to be a diplomat, because you're going to have to report, and you're also going to have to apologize for your paper's 100 years of failing this community before. There's it shouldn't be any surprise when Indigenous people don't trust you as a journalist. But if you're not just there to cover a tragedy, if you're there to build trust and relationships, then they'll recognize that. Tristan Ottone, who's the editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and on the board with me at NAJA, one of the things that he always advises reporters to do is to go to two protests, go to 2 funerals, go to 2 powwows, like go to community events and just be there. You don't have to cover them, but just show up and get to know these people and make it clear to them that you care about their community and representing it in a fully formed way. and that you are above all going to apply the same ethical standards for what constitutes a story to this community that you would yours.
You mentioned in your presentation that currently reporting is about Indigenous people and not for Indigenous people. So why is this distinction important, and what does reporting for Indigenous people look like to you?
That's a great question. So when we first started the Indigenous Affairs Desk, and really it was Tristan who spearheaded that, and then I was brought on soon after to help him kind of build it up. And one of the pitches that we used to get the most in those early couple of years was one about language revitalization programs. So tribes that were trying to save their dying language. And this is a huge problem across every tribal nation, certainly in mine. Like our native speakers, people who their first language is Cherokee, are getting older and dying. And so it's really important that we as citizens, younger citizens, learn the language and keep it alive. Like, just to put it in context, I mean, as like those of us who are born in America and identify as Americans, like if you could imagine that just like one day, like people didn't speak English anymore, like what would that mean for like your identity? I don't know. It's very complicated, but most of the time, these were always stories from non-native writers because they kind of saw it as like, I think it's really good to tell positive stories of perseverance. You know, like a lot of the stories that I think are seen as tragedy are really stories of resilience. You know, despite the odds, Native people are still holding each other up and surviving. You know, we're still here and in greater numbers than we ever have, at least for my tribe. And so, but a lot of the pitches that we would get focused on the fact that it was just a program that existed, right? That this tribe was trying to save its language. And we always pushed back because our response to that was always like, yeah, but we don't see the need to explain to this tribal community why it's important to save their language. They already know that. We're more interested in, is saving that language a treaty right? Is it a trust responsibility? Is, you know, the American government, when it entered into treaties with tribes, several of the tribes, like I mentioned earlier with IHS, it agreed to take care of them, to take care of their health, their physical well-being. Well, it also agreed to preserve their cultures. And then it went and it tried to assimilate us and destroy our cultures. So isn't it incumbent upon the US government to subsidize and help maintain those language programs? Because it's a treaty right. We just published a story from Jessica Douglas today about, on our desk about broadband connectivity. And, you know, the FCC still holds the right as federal jurisdiction to spectrum that is, you know, the radio waves that exist all over Indian country. And there are people now asking like, well, shouldn't those spectrum rights be owned by the tribes whose lands they're on? Like, as sovereign nations, don't they have the right to profit off of those and to help solve the enormous problem with connectivity in Indian country that exists because of systemic racism? So like, that's the kind of coverage that we want. I don't want a story that Native people just need broadband. I want a story about what equity looks like, and how we can achieve it. What moves the discussion forward and what informs Indigenous people. It is a fine line to dance. Most of my readers are not Indigenous. I recognize that. But historically, Indigenous readers are the ones who have been underserved. And so they're the ones who are top of mind when I'm doing my reporting. What do they need? What questions do they need answered? And how can I best represent their voice in the story? Other than, of course, quoting them directly.
Another question from a student. Considering that often a majority of academic work on Indigenous people is exploitative, do you see published academic work as a form of journalism? And how do students change that makeup of academic work?
Will, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. Considering that often a majority of academic work on Indigenous people is exploitative, do you see published academic work also as a form of journalism? And how do students change the makeup of academic work?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of without like getting into too much of like a philosophical discussion, like one of the things I like about being a journalist is that like we're documenting a point in time. And so like when I was a kid, I kind of wanted to be a documentary filmmaker for that very reason. I just really liked the idea of like capturing this really like nuanced moment in time and being able to preserve it, to learn from it. And I think journalism and academic research can be the same way. But yeah, I think I did this story last year about the Music Modernization Act, which was this bill that basically like kind of made it easier to stream certain types of music. And I would agree that like as I grew up listening to CDs, so like obviously music and how we digest it evolves. And so I think the MMA was something that needed to happen, but it didn't have Indigenous peoples in mind. And basically what it did is it kind of opened this loophole for things, recordings of Indigenous ceremonies that were taken by archaeologists and anthropologists, anthropologists, like throughout, recorded, since we've been able to have audio recording of Indigenous people doing ceremonies, singing songs. And they weren't taken, like, there wasn't this like understanding of what would happen to this music or these prayers or these ceremonies. There was just too much of an imbalance of power when these things were taken. And so one of the things that story really illuminated to me that I thought was really fascinating is that there's this whole movement of people who work at universities and archivists who are actively trying to find Indigenous recordings and then find the people who they think they belong to so that they can claim them before they are just put out onto the world by like the university who owns them and just drops them for free online. Because again, that's a resource. It's a story. It's a piece of culture that's taken for the benefit of somebody outside of that culture, somebody who was taken advantage of and decimated by colonialism. And so that taking that resource and then just using it for your own purpose is a continuation of that. That's how colonialism like keeps manifesting itself. And so I think being conscious in academic circles like that, there's this really great book called, I think it's called Blood Politics, by Cersei Sturm. And she, I believe it was in the 90s, moved to Oklahoma, moved to Tahlequah, the head of the Cherokee Nation. And she wrote a book about indigeneity, blood quantum, tribal citizenship. And she's not Native, but that book has taught me so much about the history of what it means to be a member of the Cherokee Nation. And so like, and I would point to that as an example of a piece of study like on a tribe that was done in a really respectful way. And that was done in a way that teaches Indigenous people something too. You know, I think it's important to remember that Indigenous people were also stripped of this knowledge, just like you were. And so at least many of us were. And so, yeah, it's kind of a long answer to the question, but I do think that there are ways that people in academia can, really take the time to respect and get to know a culture. Another really great book I love is called The 10 Grandmothers. And it's about, so my son he's Cherokee, but he's also Kiowa. And so I try to read a lot about Kiowa history because he's not going to learn about it in school. Like he has to learn about it in our home. And The 10 Grandmothers is this beautiful, beautiful documentation of Kiowa history. And it was done by a white academic from the University of Oklahoma, and I think in the 1940s. And it's wonderfully written. And it was written with the help and the blessing of the Kiowa tribe. And most Kiowa people I know, when I ask them, what's your favorite Kiowa history book, they say The 10 Grandmothers. And it wasn't written by a Kiowa person. So so I think there is just kind of like that question about Indigenous journalists covering Indigenous communities. Like if you put in the work, you can be good at it. And I would just add that putting in the work teaches you something about who you are and your own place in the world. And I think that's really important too. It informs, it'll inform your moral compass for, the rest of your life, if you're lucky.
So what are the ramifications of negative media portrayals of Indigenous people in terms of policy creation and implementation?
I'm really glad someone asked this question, because there was a slide I had earlier about Elizabeth Warren's blood quantum, and I meant to touch on something and I forgot to. So I think it was in 2019, a federal judge in Texas struck down the Indian Child Welfare Act as unconstitutional because he said it was based on race. Remember that Washington Post headline? It was "Baby Veronica white or Native." And when someone like Elizabeth Warren can give you the false assumption that being Native is something that you can learn from a DNA test, or it's like this quantifiable thing that you can consume, like or just that it's based on race and the amount of Indian blood in your veins, and not on the fact that you are a citizen of a sovereign nation, then it can have real bad ramifications. And so I bring up that example of the judge in Texas because the Indian Child Welfare Act, like I said, it was meant to protect Native children from being stolen from their homes and then raised in white homes, so that they would not know their language or their culture, and that they would, going back to General Pratt, kill the Indian, save the man. Um, and so when a federal judge can be under the wrong impression that being Cherokee or being Choctaw or whatever is just a racial distinction and it has nothing to do with your citizenship status, and he can try to strike it down, then that puts those Native children in real danger. And I don't want to be a part of anything like that could have that kind of harmful outcome. Thankfully, I think that that was struck down. The Cherokee Nation and other tribes are really good at coalescing around these issues that affect us all across Indian country. So lots of legal expertise on the Native side of the argument. But I think that's an example, and I'm not saying it's Elizabeth Warren's fault that judge felt that way, but I would certainly make the argument that someone with Elizabeth Warren's platform has the ability to really change people's perceptions of what it means to be Indigenous. And I think it's, that can have real damaging outcomes. And if we perpetuate that as journalists, then we're part of the problem.
Our next question comes in from an alum who says that High Country News rules and wants to hear more about your work and the ways that you specifically combat parachute journalism in the work that you do.
One of the great things about working at High Country News, besides I really just love the staff, and we all have like a really unified vision for what the magazine can be, is that we really emphasize place-based reporting, three-dimensional, on-the-ground, nuanced reporting that is representative. And so, and one of the ways that we get that, and then also accomplish one of our other goals as a desk on the Indigenous Affairs desk to hire Indigenous writers, is to find writers who are Indigenous, who are from the communities we want to cover. Like I said, there's lots and lots and lots of tribes all across the West. And so it's not always possible to find, a journalist from every community we want to cover that community. But when we can find an Indigenous journalist to cover their area, the tribe that we want to write about, I think it's one of the reasons why our desk is so representative and has been so successful covering Indian country. And it's not just that, like whenever I look at that question earlier about tribal media versus non-tribal media, when you watch a press conference and there's tribal media there and there's non-tribal media there, and you hear the questions between the two, you can tell just by the questions that they're asking who belongs to what. Because tribal media, like, they are going to have a leg up. They're going to know. I would expect a tribal police officer to understand the McGirt decision on a different level than I would an Oklahoma City police officer, for instance. So, so I really love that about High Country News, and we don't just emphasize that in our reporting. We emphasize that in our photography as well. The piece that I just edited by Nick Estes about the Black Hills and Nick Tilson's federal charges for his participation in the protest against President Trump's July 4th speech at Mount Rushmore. Taylor Irvine took that photo for us of Mount Rushmore, and I really love that photo. I think it might be my favorite one that we've ever published since I've been at the magazine, because it's this shot of the Black Hills, and then just peeking out of the side, you can see George Washington's kind of profile. I think I would guarantee that everyone here, 99% of the images you've seen of the Black Hills is a dead-on shot of Mount Rushmore, right? But to just show like the beauty of those Black Hills, and then there's just kind of this scar on the side of it, I thought, like, I didn't tell Taylor to do that. She just knew how to do it. And I think that is a really great example of the benefit of hiring Indigenous journalists to cover Indigenous communities.
So an alum wants to know that there has been a lot of coverage that focuses on non-urban Indigenous communities, and they're curious to know if you have any outlets in mind that cover Indigenous communities in urban areas.
That's a really fascinating question. Yeah, I think it's at least 70% of Indigenous people live in cities, in urban settings. And so for those of you who've read like Tommy Orange's book, There, I thought that was a really, really great example of like Indigenous urban storytelling. But in terms of places that cover exclusively Indigenous people in an urban setting, like I really can't point to any like one outlet. And in fact, like that's something that we think about a lot on our desk too, because, you know, some of the biggest cities in the country are in the West. And so, and a lot of them, you know, you look at like to places like Tacoma, like the Indigenous stamp on these cities is indelible. And so, no, that's a good question. You know, I will say this one outlet that always continues to surprise me and has for years, that I think does really good job of kind of giving those perspectives, is Teen Vogue. I think they just do such a great job. And a lot of it is because a lot of what they do is opinion pieces, which I think for some outlets, it's kind of a problem. Like, you know, when you pitch, you're an Indigenous writer and you pitch to an outlet and they're like, do you want to write this as an opinion story or report it? And you're like, well, I want to report it. I think a lot of the time the assumption is that you just want to write an op-ed, but I would point to Teen Vogue as like actually a really good example of some really thoughtful, well-edited, well-focused pieces about Indigenous peoples. And I think they hired some pretty young writers too, for obvious reasons. And so some voices that you don't typically find in the mainstream media.
Before we conclude, we want to give you the opportunity to share any closing remarks.
Man, I was really happy to be here. I really enjoy talking shop. Yeah, I guess I would just encourage you all to seek out some of those Indigenous voices in the stories that you read. You know, one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that Standing Rock was like this huge part of our national dialogue for at least like a good solid year. And I think it like dramatically changed the landscape of how we as readers and editors, like producers of news and consumers of it, like view Indigenous stories and what happens in tribal lands. And I bet you a lot of people here were like really paying attention to that, or at least consuming a lot of news about Standing Rock. And if you were, I would ask yourself one question: what's happening on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation today? If you don't know the answer to that question, that might tell you a little something about like how important those stories are to you, and you know what you might be missing. So, yeah.
On behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Graham Lee Brewer and to all of those who sent in their questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be Monday, February 8th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Professor Gary Hoover of Tulane University will join us to discuss racial inequality and economic policymaking. See you all then.